President Muhammadu Buhari has presented to the National Assembly a budget of 20.5 trillion naira for the 2023 fiscal year, christened Budget of Fiscal Consolidation and Transition. The president says it is expected to consolidate on the infrastructural gains of the last 7 years. Arise correspondent Tunji Olanipekun filed this report. Here it is.
This is the last time President Muhammadu Buhari will be performing this function as his tenure expires in May 2023. He therefore began the presentation by recounting the achievements of his administration in the last 7 years in the areas of fiscal discipline, security, revenue generation and power generation.
Over the last year, this administration has implemented several priority projects. Our focus has been on key road and rail projects, the effective implementation of power sector projects, the provision of clean water, construction of irrigation infrastructure and dams across the country, and critical health projects such as upgrading primary health care centers across the 6 geopolitical zones.
And then he proceeded to the budget proposal. President Buhari set the following budget parameters and fiscal assumptions. Daily oil production estimates at 1.69 million barrels per day. Oil price benchmark was put at $70 per barrel, while exchange rate is fixed at 435 naira 57 kobo to a dollar. The budget has a projected gross domestic product growth rate of 3.75% and 17.16% inflation rate. The country has a revenue target of 16.87 trillion naira. Out of this, oil revenue is projected at 1.92 trillion naira, non-oil taxes 2.43 trillion naira, and government independent revenues was set at 2.21 trillion naira. The retained revenues of the government-owned enterprises is estimated at 2.42 trillion naira.
Government is not unaware of the challenges confronting the manufacturing sector. Effective implementation of policy measures aimed at positioning the manufacturing sector to generate more foreign exchange in the near future. We are also committed to improving local and foreign investment.
The president promises more fiscal discipline to complete ongoing projects and help fund other sectors such as education, power and agriculture. The leadership of the National Assembly says it will work with the executive to achieve prompt passage of the budget, but frowned at the huge economic sabotage from massive oil theft.
Mr. President, permit me to convey the disquiet in the House of Representatives arising from the reports of a massive decline in the volume of crude oil exports due primarily and diversion by criminal elements. It is the sense of the House of Representatives those engaged in these activities are agents of economic sabotage, determined to bring our country to its knees.
Mr. President, our economy is still challenged by that of revenues. The main source of revenue to the Nigerian government is oil and gas. We always consider the diversification of our economy as crucial, and it is indeed crucial. The idea of deploying our revenues from the oil and gas to support the diversification into real sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, mining, etc. is now under serious threat. The large-scale and massive stealing of our oil is concerning, as this reduces drastically the revenues available to the government.
With the document laid before the Parliament by the President, the responsibility has now shifted to the lawmakers, who are expected to do a thorough job to ensure that the appropriation bill is presented for presidential assent before December 31, 2022.
For a breakdown of the figures and how much of the budget can be achieved, as well as which areas to prioritize in its implementation, we're now being joined by Chukwu, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Cowrie Asset Management Company Limited. Well, Chief Johnson Chukwu. Hi, Chief, double Chief, because very soon I'm sure you are going to get an additional chieftaincy title from Yoruba land. I don't know why your name is not on their national honors list.
No, let's start from my Biokuta.
No, you should even be on the national honors list because it's people like you that should be there. But let's look at this budget 2023. The immediate preliminary introductory paragraphs were devoted to the achievements of the administration, particularly with regard to infrastructure. The president devoted some time to his achievements with infrastructure, with good governance, with legislation, the rule of law. I had Uwonikoko SAN. I wanted to ask him even about that aspect of the budget speech, but there wasn't enough time. So those achievements with regard to infrastructure, good governance, and all the things that the president listed in an attempt by the speechwriters to construct his legacy, which I think is a good idea. What do you think? Do you think he was lying to the National Assembly, or there are some claims to merit in that regard?
Well, like you rightly pointed out, he needed to write his own appraisal. And it was because that was the last budget speech he was going to make. And they said if you do not sing your praises, nobody may sing it. So if you look at those things that the president highlighted, I think largely most of them are true. In terms of legislation or what the government has done in terms of improving the business environment, he mentioned the issue of passage of the CAMA, Companies and Allied Matters Act. He talked about the Petroleum Industry Act. He talked about the Competition Act. So these are facts of the matter. You can't deny that in terms of the pieces of legislation that the government has put together, particularly if you look at the legislation that governs the oil and gas sector, it's been in the works for almost 20 years. The fact that this government was able to do it is a major achievement that we cannot dismiss. The CAMA, some of the introductions into CAMA are also landmark in their nature, given the fact that what the government has gone out to do is to ensure that we improve on the formalization of the economy so that even an individual can set up and incorporate a company like what you used to have in the past. So, and again, this government also were able to increase value-added tax from 5% to 7.5%. Without any whimper from the labor groups or any other group. So I think in talking about what they've done in terms of legislation, one must give them a pass mark for that. Because if some of those pieces of legislation are assiduously implemented, then they should be able to attract some benefit to the economy. For instance, the issue of the Petroleum Industry Act. One of the hallmarks of that Petroleum Industry Act, which has been suspended or put in abeyance, is the issue of fuel subsidy. So any government that comes in can just implement an existing law without necessarily have to go to the National Assembly to pass that law. Of course, the law may be subject to some level of amendments in future, but it was something that at the end of the day, Nigerians must give them credit for passing some of the most complex and difficult legislation that we had under previous government were able to pass over a period of 20 years. In terms of infrastructure, I would say the infrastructural build has been going on. Maybe it's not going at the speed I, as a person, as a Nigerian, would want to see, given the level of economic research been committed to it, given the level of borrowing the government has actually accumulated for the country. Take, for instance, the president's speech. He said the first 7 months of this year, they've only spent 1.48 trillion naira in capital expenditure, out of the 8.29 trillion naira the government has spent. That's an inconsequential amount, given at the same time you had a budget deficit of 4.63 trillion naira. So of the 4.6 trillion naira we borrowed, we only spent 1.48 trillion naira on capital expenditure. So in effect, I don't think we are building so much of capital goods that would catalyze economic productivity at the rate at which we are accumulating debt. But you don't take away the fact that they have done some things, but the key thing here, if you look at value for money, and you look at the magnitude of debt we have accumulated, and that what proportion of that, even that debt, because the minimum we would have said is that whatever we are borrowing is going into capital expenditure, so that at the end of the day, we are building the infrastructure that will create productivity, so they say that we will earn a high level of gross domestic production or high level of revenue to pay back those debts.
Okay, one thing that the president raised in that speech What a revenue shortfall was a major threat to the implementation of the 2022 budget. Now we have been told that the major theme and priorities of this 2023 budget is fiscal consolidation, fiscal viability, the consolidation of transition. But if you look at the parameters, oil price benchmark of 70 US dollars, daily oil production of 1.69 million barrels per day, with condensates between 300,000 and 400,000, and the exchange rate of about 435.57 to US dollar, and projected growth rate of 3.5%, and inflation at 17.16%. At the moment, inflation rate is over 20%. So all these parameters don't seem to make sense. What is the guarantee that this will indeed be a budget of fiscal sustainability? What are we sustaining? What are we consolidating? What are we transitioning to?
Okay, let's start from the issue of fiscal sustainability. If you talk of fiscal sustainability, you obviously you are going to invest, one, in infrastructure. Two, you are going to have the appropriate regulatory and policy framework that will ensure private sector investment, because the economy today is focused on private sector driven growth. So those are the two issues. But in terms of fiscal sustainability, there is a conflict between the focus or the direction of the budget and the monetary policy's direction. And it's direct conflict, and I have to explain this. The Monetary Policy Committee came in September and said, look, we're increasing the cash reserve ratio to 32.5%, and we're increasing the monetary policy rate. At the same time, the Monetary Policy Committee has, in effect, shrunk the level of liquidity in the economy, because the intention is to slow down inflation, which came at a rate of 20.52% in August. So if the Monetary Policy Committee emphasis is to bring down inflation by contracting the level of liquidity in the economy, the fiscal authority, if we're talking about fiscal consolidation, cannot come in on the other side and create a budget deficit of 10.7 trillion naira. So in effect, what you're going to see is you're going to see injection of liquidity of about 10.97 trillion naira. It's not backed by productivity. So in effect, it's going to neutralize whatever the Monetary Policy Committee is doing to fight inflation, which puts to question mark the target inflation rate of 17.16%. If we're on 20.52%, at the time the Monetary Policy Committee said we're going to apply the brakes on liquidity. We're going to apply the brakes on credit creation, particularly the private sector. At the same time, the government has opened the till or opened the vault, and they're saying we're going to borrow 8.8 trillion naira from largely the local economy and borrow about 1.77 trillion naira from our bilateral and multilateral partners to fund a budget deficit of 10.97 trillion. So in effect, you may not be able to achieve fiscal consolidation. What you're going to see is a situation where inflation will go up, pressure on exchange rate will go up because of this current level of expenditure.
Okay, the president said, okay, there's a fiscal deficit, right? And they will borrow from different sides. But if you look at the Fiscal Responsibility Act, what they are planning to borrow is about 4.76%, right? So we had on Friday a situation whereby the president of Nigeria was presenting a piece of illegality, because to be a violation, what is being proposed will be a violation of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, whereby the threshold is within the range of 3%.
Okay.
So what should the National Assembly do about that, considering the fact that the budget is merely a proposal for an appropriation act? And we've been violating this Fiscal Responsibility Act.
Yeah, if you recall, during the height of the COVID,
yes,
the president went to the National Assembly and asked for a suspension of that provision.
Yeah, you said so. For a suspension of the act?
A section of that act. He asked
But
National
so why
Assembly
was
to
he
suspend.
putting it on Friday?
No, he made reference to it, but if you recall, in 2020, he went to the National Assembly and asked that provision of the fiscal responsibility should be suspended because they needed to fight the economic crisis occasioned by COVID. What I can remember very well, if that suspension was for a year, and therefore every fiscal strategy paper, medium-term expenditure framework, fiscal strategy paper should have come with a proviso to suspend that segment or that provision of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So I'm not sure of that. But if it was not suspended, then the first thing the National Assembly needs to do, if they have to pass this bill into law, is to go and amend that segment of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. If they don't amend it, then the totality of the budget becomes illegal. But I believe, having highlighted that, assuming they have not noted it, but what I can remember, like I said, he came to the National Assembly and specifically requested for that suspension of that provision. But back to what we're looking at. The key thing that the president, we must realize about this budget is that it is so expansionary that it's difficult for anybody who is in the private sector to justify it. For you to appreciate this, it simply means I'm earning a salary of 100,000 a month, or let's assume I'm earning 1 million a year, and then I plan to spend 2.2 million naira in a year. And I'm hoping that I will go and borrow 1.2 million naira to supplement my 1 million naira. And the greater portion of that expenditure is going to be on paying of salaries, my lifestyle, living. That's where the problem is. If you look at the breakdown of the budget, of the 20.51 trillion naira the government has budgeted, only provision of 5.35 trillion was made for capital expenditure. Non-debt recurrent expenditure is 8.27 trillion naira. That's almost equivalent to the total revenue the government plans to generate. 8.27 trillion naira, of which salaries and wages, wage bill is 4.99 trillion naira. So in effect, the greater portion of that budget, assuming it's fully implemented, will be largely overhead of the government. And in effect, what we are doing is that we are spending money and accumulating debt that we're not building the economic base that will generate economic activity that will earn us the revenue to pay back the debt. And that simply means we are pushing the economy into a level where the debt profile will no longer be sustainable. If we borrow 8.8 trillion and you add it to what we currently own, which is about more than 40 trillion, 46, about 46 trillion, you are going to end up with a debt of 54 trillion naira.
Well, they claim you were owing 42.8.
So if you add 42.8 to 8 trillion, to 10 trillion, because even the bilateral loans is part of the loans. If you add 10 trillion to 42 trillion, you are going to end up with about 52 trillion. In fact, if you look at
but they say within that is 40% of GDP. And that it's okay, it's fine for us to owe.
Yeah,
wasn't that what the president said?
You see,
he said the average internationally is higher.
The difference is this.
So we can keep borrowing.
The most economists in the world, the president made allusion to the fact that our revenue to GDP is only 8%.
Yes, the president said
and that is the core of your debt ability to pay back your debt. And the president said the intention is to grow it to 15%.
Yes, he said
so. Until you grow it to 15%, at 8%, it then means you are getting to a point where even the revenue you generate will not be able to pay that interest payment. Let me give an instance. IMF and World Bank have said that in the current fiscal year, Nigeria's debt service to revenue will be about 105%. I think IMF said 105%, World Bank said 110%. What that means is that we're going to spend every kobo we generated as revenue to pay interest, and we're going to borrow another 10% of the total revenue we generated to pay interest. Then after you've done that, you now borrow to pay the non-debt recorded rate of 8.27%. You go further and borrow to incur capital expenditure of 5.25 trillion. And then the other elements of government overhead, running costs. So how sustainable is that if you are supposed to be a company or a household? As it stands today, if you look at even the first 7 months of this year, which the president presented, he said total federal government revenue in the first 7 months of this year was 3.66 trillion naira. Deficit.
39.6 trillion.
Yes. And that as at the end of the first 7 months of this year, we had borrowed 4.6 trillion naira. So we generated only 3.66 trillion naira, which validates what IMF and World Bank are saying. So in effect, our debt today is not sustainable if we're not a government. If it was not a government that had the capacity to tax and had the capacity to print money, if it was to be a private sector operator, it would be difficult for us to borrow today.
Okay, Hi Chief Johnson Chukwu. Let's bring it down to the level of the common man. What is the meaning of all of this for the average man? In terms of, for example, the assumptions in that budget. They say, we'll produce 1.69 million barrels per day. There's no guarantee that Nigeria can do that. Now that some people for more than 9 years are taking pipelines to the ICs, and we can't even, under the 2022 budget, we couldn't even meet the projections. The president says, it's crude oil theft, it's pipeline vandalism. Will pipeline vandalism and crude oil theft suddenly disappear? Okay? We're told that the benchmark is $70 per barrel. What is the guarantee that it will be $70 per barrel? On Wednesday, OPEC Plus took a decision to cut production by 2 million barrels. The US and the Western allies, they're saying, no, this will affect us. We cannot allow it to stand. So certain things will happen. Exchange rate, they say 453.57 to the dollar. Today, the thing is over $700, and it could get worse. There are economists who are saying by December it should be about $1,000. Projected growth rate is still in the single-digit range. There's no guarantee that will meet double digit. Okay, this is 8th and final budget of the Buhari administration. What are the prospects for the next administration?
Okay, let me take the first part of your question, which is what does it mean for the man on the street? I'll take several segments of the budget presentation and try to paint some scenarios. If, for instance, the government succeeds in achieving a crude production of 1.69 million barrels a day, contrary to what the president said that we have only done 1.3 million barrels average in the first 6 months of this year. So if we achieve 1.69 million barrels a day, what that means is that we're going to earn a lot more foreign exchange. If we earn a lot more foreign exchange income, our foreign reserve will strengthen, then our local currency will strengthen. That means the exchange rate will improve, particularly the parallel market, because what the central bank will now have the war chest to fund the economy better and reduce the pressure we're facing. So the average man on the street will have a lower Naira exchange rate, and the man who does not really bother about the Naira exchange rate, the implication is that imported goods into the country, prices will moderate. So, or at the minimum, the current inflation rate will moderate, because part of the inflation we're facing today is driven by what they call pass-through effect of depreciation of the local currency. That's one aspect. Then the other aspect, which I've also brought in the issue of exchange rate, the government has planned to do exchange rate of 435 Naira to a dollar. That, the implication of that is that for disbursement, allocation, and sharing of federally generated revenue to the states and the 3 tiers of government will be at 435 Naira to a dollar. What that means is that the states are not able to enjoy the full benefit of the current exchange rate, because the government officials at the subnational levels do not buy anything or import anything or spend anything based on 435 Naira to a dollar. So if they had allowed the exchange rate to move, then it would have allowed the state governments and local government to earn more Naira revenue, and then that will make it easier for them to pay their salaries and wages and salaries of their employees and meet other overhead of the government. So that's one aspect of it. Then the other aspect of the budget in terms of capital expenditure. The government is planning to spend about 5.35 trillion naira. Assuming it succeeds in doing that, then it means that they're going to see a lot more injection of liquidity into the economy. That injection of liquidity in the economy, because it's going to create some level of employment, particularly those in the blue-collar job segment. But that also depends on if the government is able to generate this revenue. Well, like I said, in the first 7 months of this year, they were only able to spend 1.48 trillion naira out of a total expenditure of 8.27 trillion naira. If that pattern is sustained, then the budget for capital expenditure will be hardly spent, which the minister made allusion to, that we're getting to a point where it may be difficult to fund capital expenditure from budgetary allocations. And that also means that at that point, those who have contractors, who have government jobs, who they're asking to go back to site, should not bother going back to site. Those who are currently employed by those contractors may be laid off. So that's how it relates to the man on the street. Then, what are the prospects of this budget, which is the final segment of your question? A lot depends on the government's ability to borrow, because more than 50% of the government expenditure is going to be borrowed. So, if that borrowing does not happen, because it's going to be a very tough thing to borrow 8.8 trillion naira from the local economy, given the tightness of the international bond market. So I don't see the federal government coming to the Eurobond market to borrow, given the current tightness of the market. So it simply means it's going to try to generate that from local borrowing. He said he borrowed about 4.12 trillion locally in the first 7 months of this year. So if you want to borrow 8.8 trillion, you're going to crowd out the private sector, which means cost of borrowing would go up, but cost of loans or interest rate will go up drastically, and it will constrain productive activities in the real sector of the economy. Then, because the government may not easily borrow that amount, then the possibility that we're going to have full implementation, particularly the capital expenditure budget, which is what we call discretionary expenditure, because the government will only spend it on capital expenditure or capital project if it gets the resources. They are not discretionary expenditure the government must incur. Debt service, 6.31 trillion naira. Come rain, comes on, the first thing the government will do is to pay those debt. Second is the wage bill, which is 4.99 trillion naira. The government will pay that. After those ones, every other thing may suffer.
Okay. High Chief Johnson Chukwu, with this grim scenario, where does that leave the closing paragraphs of the president's statement about, they promise to invest in health, education, social protection, safe schools initiative, defense and internal security, when we have before us a budget that is based on borrowing? And would the next government just say that, well, simply this will not work? What options? That was the other leg of my question. What options are available to the next government? Because whoever is going to become president of Nigeria at this moment is inheriting an economy on wheels, on stilts, in a wheelchair.
Well, I think the next government has their job well cut out for them. The first thing is that the next government must focus on attracting private sector investment to the economy. I was looking at the figures and I realized that a country as small as Egypt, although Egypt is not small, has attracted more than $22 billion as capital importation into that country.
American support, yeah?
Yeah, but this one is even from the Gulf regions.
Okay.
22 billion this year. And the $22 billion it's almost more than half of the present budget. So if the next government focus on attracting private sector investment, all you just need is define the opportunities for the economy. Is it infrastructure? Do we have sectors of the economy we're going to pass on to the private sector? Like what we did when we brought in the GSMs, when we licensed the GSM company. There were 3 companies that paid $285 million. Each to get a license. We just licensed the 5Gs. 2 companies paid for it. We can also concession the seaports and allow private capital to build them. We can concession the airports and allow private capital to build the aerofields. We can concession the railway corridors and allow private capital to come in there. The transmission grid can go to the private sector and they will strengthen it. That will have several sectors of the economy we're going to bring in capital, and that will, one, reduce the burden of the government to invest in infrastructure. So the 5.35 trillion we have budgeted will be eliminated. Second issue, take out the subsidy. There are projections in this budget of about 3.6 trillion naira, 3.7 trillion in the first half of the year for subsidy payments. In effect, at the end of the full year, you're going to have more than 6 trillion naira as capital expenditure on subsidy. If you take out that alone, you're going to improve on the revenue accruable to the three tiers of government. So if, for instance, you eliminate 6 trillion naira on subsidy and eliminate 5.5 trillion naira, 5.35 trillion naira on capital expenditure, largely, you have saved about 11 trillion naira. So in effect, you don't need...
You believe, as many economists argue, that the subsidy on petrol has to go?
It is not whether I believe. It is something that even the president has eventually accepted is inevitable. Ruben, can you explain why the man or the woman in my village cannot get 2 hours of power supply from national grid, do not have pipe bomb water, do not have good road, just because you and I are driving vehicles that are subsidized, the fuel is subsidized? Are Nigerians better off from subsidy when we don't have good health care, quality education? I mean, you guys spoke extensively on the strike by university lecturers. I'm not sure what the university lecturers have been agitating for a sort of 3 trillion naira.
Okay, on this note, I would like to thank you very much. High Chief, Double Chief Johnson Chukwu, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Cowrie Asset Management Company Limited. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on this Day Live, the Sunday talk show.